Good evening and a very warm welcome to the Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library. This is the second of our events which we are doing online. And before we begin the program, I would request Shanjuk Tadi to say a few words.
Could you say who Shangjukta is?
Oh, okay. Yes, I think I should do. I'm taking it for granted.
No, I'm live.
Right. Before we begin the evening's event, I would request the IPPL President, the Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library President, Professor Shanjukta Dashgupta, to begin the evening's programs. Shanjukta Di.
Thank you, Nishi. Nishi is our secretary of IPPL and absolutely the most dynamic person on whom we depend for all this, and she can mute and unmute us at will. And so I'm really very, very happy today that we are being able to hold this session on poetry with two very, very dear persons from the capital. And when the Rajdhani is asked, we know that the sky is the limit. So I'm delighted that we have Professor Malashri Lal, who is a dear friend and also an indispensable member of the IPPL Advisory Committee. And of course, Bashobi, who has been the founder, and I'm so happy that she has been able to take time out today and be with us. And Sudeep, who has been a friend for a long time, and the first time I met him was in Dhaka. And so it's just wonderful that we sometimes share our poetry, and very lately we also met at an event. It's an exciting moment for IPPL that we could bring so many poets and talented people together, and all of us who are in love with creative words. But at the same time, today we begin our session with a bit of sad news. Many of you may have heard on the 1st of July, that is 2 days earlier, Dr. H.K. Kaul, who has played a huge role as one of the stalwarts of post-independence Indian English poetry in particular, and Indian poetry in English translation specifically, in terms of starting the Poetry Society of India, a poetry journal, and also competition for all aspirant poets. And that too, he had continued since 1988. And we feel that we need to pay homage to him more particularly because I recently met him, I would say very late last year, again organized by Professor Malashri Lal, a meeting with other very distinguished people of Delhi in order to start the Delhi chapter of IPPL. And in that meeting, I met Dr. Kaul for the first time, and I was very, very impressed by his very unassuming, soft-spoken manner, and also his very good understanding of societies, organizations, which are absolutely not funded by any corporate bodies, and how we need to survive in those circumstances, because non-profit organizations have some difficulty, but if there is not profit in material terms, we all profit a great deal in terms of creative terms, because there is no such self-interest involved apart from weaving words together and sharing that. And so Dr. H.K. Kaul, library and information science specialist, author, poet, bibliographer, and institutional builder, displayed in his personality the wisdom of a knowledge expert, 50 years experience as a library specialist, the creativity of a poet, and the man with a vision who established two institutions, the DELNET, Developing Library Network in 1988, and the Poetry Society of India in 1984. I had referred to this earlier. I just want to refer very briefly to his publications, after which I will ask Professor Malashri Lal to speak about him a little, because she knew him personally for decades. And just to inform the audience today, Dr. Kaul's first book came out in 1972. And since then, he had authored and edited 58 books, besides research papers and over 100 articles in the fields of library networking, bibliographical studies, history, poetry, and publishing. He examined in the 1970s thousands of rare books on India and produced Travelers, India and Historic Delhi, both published by the Oxford University Press. His books on library science and networking include Library Networks and Indian Experience and many others. And his last book, I think, in terms of what is available on the net, was published in 2017. And I'm sure with the sort of prolific writer he was, probably I'm missing out on a few more of his publications. We extend our sincere condolences to the bereaved family, and we deeply register our respect for someone who has inspired us for so long in the field of poetry, Dr. H.K. Kaul. And now I will ask Malashri Lal to speak a few words about Dr. Kaul. Thank you.
Good evening, Bashobi, Shonjukta, Nishi, Sudeep, the many other friends and colleagues that I see on the screen today. It's a great privilege to be with you this afternoon and to begin the session with a tribute to Dr. H.K. Kaul, librarian, writer, poet, and an institution builder. And indeed, Shonjukta is right that I and many of us in Delhi have known Dr. Kaul for many, many years. I suppose one could easily go back to 30 years because that was the time he started putting in a huge effort into building up the wonderful collection at the India International Center Library. Dr. Kaul was a man of vision. So not only did he acquire the correct books, but he also was able to get some rare research collections for the library, which are absolutely unique and indispensable to students of history, psychology, sociology, and of course, literature. Dr. Kaul was also a visionary in another way, and that is DELNET, this extraordinary facility that puts together the libraries around the country into a network of supplying books to each other free of cost to the individual reader and researcher. With his acumen, with his quiet wisdom, with his amazing organizational skills that Shonjukta has also mentioned, he was able to convince all the major libraries in the country, IITs, Institute of Advanced Studies, all the universities, to contribute to this enterprise. And I was one among the hundreds of beneficiaries at the IIC library. When we needed a book, we simply filled in a request form and the book would arrive from different parts of the country and be at the library desk in, at the most, a week. It didn't cost us as a reader anything at all. This vision, which began with supplying research material to scholars and researchers, teachers and writers, expanded into the very large institution that DELNET has become. And with its facility and its building on the JNU campus, it has been one of the great literary and social intellectual resources of this city. So indeed, how Dr. Kaul managed to combine so many roles of being an astute librarian, an institution builder, a writer, and a poet, and a person who was interested in travel and in history. it is just amazing how much he achieved in his life. So when the news came of his passing on the 1st of July, as you can understand, we were left devastated. We were in a state of shock and disbelief. And even now, it's very difficult for me to talk of Dr. H.K. Kaul in the past tense. So I would like to pay my humble tribute to him on behalf of all of us at the IPPL, because he was also an advisor to IPPL Calcutta and was willing to put in the effort to create IPPL Delhi. I remember him with deep respect and great fondness. Thank you.
So can we begin the next part of our program?
Now move on to our program. We call this Indian Poetry, Past, Present and Future. And this is our first session. And in today's session, we have Professor Malashri Lal and Sudeep Sen. And I would like to first introduce both our guests today before we begin. And Professor Malashri Lal needs no introduction. However, I will introduce her for everyone. She is a writer and an academic. She had been a professor at the English Department, University of Delhi. Professor Lal is a member of the English Advisory Board of the Sahitya Academy and also part of the Bharatiya Gyanpeeth's Advisory Committee. Her specialization is in literature, women, and gender studies. Her books include In Search of Sita, Revisiting Mythology, Tagore and the Feminine, A Journey Through Translations, and Finding Radha, The Quest for Love. Professor Lal has been a senior consultant to the Ministry of Culture, a UGC nominee on committees, and a member of International Book Award juries. And Professor Lal is also a member of the advisory board of the IPPL, Intercultural Poetry and Performance Library. It's wonderful to have you with us, Professor Lal.
Thank you.
Our poet for this evening is Mr. Sudeep Sen. And Sudeep Sen also needs no introduction. Sudeep Sen's prize-winning books include Postmarked India, New and Selected Poems, Rain, Fractals, New and Selected Poems, Translations 1980 to 2015, Aerotext, and Kefi Azmi, Poems, Nazms. He has edited influential anthologies, including the HarperCollins Book of English Poetry, World English Poetry, and Modern English Poetry by Younger Indians. Blue Nude, Anthropocene, Ekphrasis, and New Poems, and The Whispering Anklets are forthcoming. Sen's work have been translated into over 25 languages. His works have appeared in the Times Literary Supplement, Newsweek, Guardian, Observer, Independent, Telegraph, Financial Times, Herald, Poetry Review, Literary Review, Harvard Review, Hindu, Hindustan Times, Times of India, Indian Express, Outlook, India Today, and has been broadcast on BBC, PBS, CNN, IBN, NDTV, All India Radio, and Doordarshan. Sen's newer work appears in New Writing 15 Granta, Language for a New Century, Leela, an erotic play of verse and art, Indian Love Poems, Out of Bounds, Initiate, Oxford New Writing, and Name Me a Word. He is the editorial director of ARC Arts and the editor of Atlas. Sen is the first Asian honored to deliver the Derek Walcott Lecture and read at the Nobel Laureate Festival. The Government of India awarded him the Senior Fellowship for Outstanding Persons in the field of culture, literature. I would now hand over the proceedings to Professor Lal. We will have a discussion which will be followed by a question-answer session. And I would request everyone to please key in your questions in the chat box for that. Professor Lal and Mr. Sen.
Thank you. Thank you, Nishi. Sudeep and I both have links with Calcutta, Bengal, and we don't usually talk about it. But today I'm going to place Sudeep straight into the heart of Calcutta, not too far from the Oxford bookstore and all those familiar areas. Because earlier this year, this COVID year, as it's now coming to be called, Sudeep's latest book was launched in Calcutta. And this is called Sudeep Sen Selected Conversations and Interviews. I chose that as the baseline for our discussion today because this is one of 3 volumes that is being published, and some of it has been published about and by Sudeep Sen. So this first book is already available, which comprise of interviews. The second volume will include Sudeep's, it will include critical essays and reviews of Sudeep's work. And the third volume is going to carry Sudeep's own non-fiction critical and creative essays. So that's a large corpus of material that we look forward to. But the interviews themselves, which span almost all his career until the present time, gives me the right stepping stone for moving into the questions that I have for Sudeep. So Sudeep, I don't know if you would like to also read something first and then we'll launch into the questions.
So let me actually read a poem first as a mark of respect to Dr. Kaul and to everyone who's suffering. We're all in lockdown. We're all in a sort of situation where it's a situation of distress. So let me just read an old poem, but for the moment, just dedicated to him and others. And it's called Offering. The kindness of libation, lyric, and blood. Her endless notes left for me little secrets, graces, trills recorded on blue and purple parchment to be lipped, tasted, devoured. Only the essence remains, its stickiness, its juice, its memory. Seamless juxtaposition, the brute and the passion, dry of the bone and wet of the sea, coarseness of the page and smooth of the nib's iridium. I try and trace a line, a very long line. The ink blots as this line's linear edge dissolves and frays like capillary threads gone mad, twirling in the deep heat of the tropics. Threads unraveling, each sinew tense with the want of moisture and the other's flesh. There are no endings here, only beginnings. Precious incipients, translucent drops of sweat perch precariously on a collarbone, waiting to slide, roll unannounced into the gullies that yearn to soak in the rain. Heartbeats shift the shape of globules as they alter their balance and color, changing their very point of gravity, constantly deceiving the other. I stand wanting more of the bone's dry edge, the infinite blur of desire, the dream, the wet, the salt, the ink, and the underside of her skin.
Thank you, Sudeep. Indeed, a very moving poem and very characteristic of you, if I may say so. The language and the metaphors are absolutely enchanting. So I want to take this a little further and ask you about your use of metaphors. There's a line in the interviews where you say poetry is music, poetry is gold. Two very different words that you're using there. So are you indicating an overarching kind of an aesthetic experience to all of them? how do you put in that formulation, poetry, music, and gold into one unit?
So, you know, I grew up as a science student, as many of you know. So, studying chemistry and physics and mathematics was very much the core part of my upbringing. Though, since you are going to be putting me in a Bengali context, and I'm happy to be in that space because that's the only thing I know. I grew up around a lot of poetry, music, and art. So there was this sort of very bipolar situation where I was expected to pursue science, but around me there was lots of arts, highly lovely people, parents, and so on, and relatives, but they were apprehensive about me getting into the arts as a profession. Those days, of course, you know, we didn't have so many choices. So gold, as you know, in the periodic table is precious metal. It's one of the few metals which cannot be tarnished. And to me, poetry, for me, is a vocation. It's something that I've actually chosen to do voluntarily over many other things. And it's a space I do not want to be tarnished, regardless of whatever happens all around. So that's one part of it. Music and dance and arts, especially music and dance, are two areas which I'm particularly interested in. I often collaborate with various dancers and musicians. And if you think about it, poetry is the basis, the fountainhead of everything. Of course, I'm hugely biased when it comes to poetry, but poetry was the first piece of literature. Beowulf came much later, but the reason people use rhyme and structure was because it was simply a practical way of remembering things, because it was oral literature at the time. It was passed down from generation to generation. So musicality and rhythm aided memory. Those, to me, the touchstones are the classics. I always resort to them because without them, you cannot possibly go forward. So those are the overarching aesthetics. So therefore, probably I said it sort of spontaneously and now I have to justify it with great elaboration. But that is really where it comes from, gold and music.
That's a marvelous shorthand for putting your different interests together, and we can see the lovely artwork behind you, Sudeep.
There's Rabindranath right at the back with his own handwriting. One of the pages from his diaries, actually. It belongs to the family, which I have since stolen. It's just behind my head, right there.
Special. Do you want to read a poem that illustrates this idea of the untarnishable gold and how it's poetry? Your poetry.
Yes. I think some people have got their audio on.
Yeah,
so
please mute them.
So yes, let me read you a poem I wrote yesterday, actually. It's called Grain. And the reference to the first part is to Bengal, and the second part, the reference is to North India and Delhi, two essential sort of bases of mine. And of course, it starts with the Annoprashan, the sort of rice ceremony. The short poem, literally hot off the notebook and hot off the laptop, called Grain, dedicated to two young friends of mine. From a grain of rice to a grain of wheat, ink links our tissues, blood binds our love for words, weaving its sanctity, etching precisely each grain, pure as gold drop, patient, a prayer unfolding as an epic.
I don't know whether IPPL can claim the copyright of that for being the first platform on which you've presented this lovely poem.
Why not? Why not? As long as they pay me generously, I'm okay.
Good. I'll let IPPL Finance Committee decide on that one. So one of the other statements that comes in your interviews and sometimes in your writing is, I did not choose poetry, poetry chose me. It's almost as though it's a statement of destiny, and yet it's not something that happened suddenly to you, Sudeep, that you devoted yourself to the craft of writing. But since I'm familiar with your work for so many years, you've been present at critical shifts in the emergence of Indian poetry. And you have also said that just too much is being talked about the Indian writing of fiction and not enough about the Indian writing of poetry in English. So, would you like to elaborate on that point about being chosen by poetry?
It's God. It's a blessing, really. I have not much to do with it. I was being pushed by society into non-poetic spaces, but I've ended up in this space. So at some level, yes, it's destiny, but at other levels, it's the conscious choice. I can do with a lot less in life as far as materially is concerned, but poetry, amazingly, I would have never thought so, has allowed me to travel the world, inhabit other people's minds, be part of generosity of other people's friendships, their work. It's something that I would have never thought would happen, but poetry allows you that. It cuts through gender, it cuts through political barrier, it cuts through all sorts of things, because when you're on stage reading a poem and the poem connects with the eardrum or the reader, nothing else matters but the words. Nothing else matters but the heart. Nothing else actually matters of, as far as the reverberations that poetry gives you, because actually a lot of it is in the aftertaste. It lingers. It's the only kind of art form that actually relies on echolocation, on the whole aspect of lingering. And anything that lingers stays a lot longer, revisits you like a wave, like wavelets. So in a sense, it's been magical. So I don't even know how to sort of intellectualize it, because it is not the way it works, because I would be in a very different space. Um, Fortunately, because of my science background, since I studied a fair bit, it helps to locate myself in certain kinds of theoretical and intellectual and academic constructs, and it's useful. But sometimes I feel that people forget the first source, the primary source, and talk too much about the secondary and the tertiary sources. And sometimes, to my aghast situation, that I meet people who were discussing a novel, and soon I realized 5 minutes into the conversation that they've only read the reviews and the flapjacket texts. Now, that's not the sort of space I want to be, but they're very erudite, you see, because clever people can be very erudite. The other part of your question about being present at certain important shifts is just, again, one of those accidents of time. But I have to really pay obeisance to my seniors, because I grew up in that sort of very traditional space where mentorship, the Gurukul system, was very important. I don't see that much, that particular thing happening that much, sadly. But the elders imparted the kind of wisdom in a quiet sort of way was invaluable as far as I'm concerned. So the senior poets in the English language poetry scene, such as people like Nissim Ezekiel, Jonathan Mohapatra, who I'm still in touch with pretty much every day, Dom Moraes, there's so many. These are the people who sort of did all the hard work and laid the foundation for many of us. Prior to that, you have, the other English language poets, the Naidus and the Madhusudhan Dutts and so on and so forth. So it's very important to know your background and lineage, because you cannot create in a vacuum. A young poet suddenly would say that, look, I've written this poem and this is absolutely brand new. I said, this has been done 30 years ago. It's just that you haven't quite read it. Also, the other thing is, even though I love social media, it's very useful, love technology, I love the laptop, everything about bits and bytes are fantastic. But unfortunately, a lot of people put up, especially the millennials, put up their work online before even if it's cooked. It's sort of, if people like eating half-boiled eggs and rice, then that's perfect recipe. But they might have written something the night before and it's up on the screen. 5 people like it. The sixth person likes it from Uzbekistan, and then suddenly they're internationally acclaimed poets. It's a worrying trend. And with, of course, COVID, every Besura person is broadcasting their songs. You know, people are dancing away. Poetry has gone completely crazy. I don't have a problem with it, but there has to be some sort of filters and checks. Because publishing poetry is not easy, as we all know. You know, very few mainstream publishers touch it. And then beyond that, certainly in India, there are very, very few small literary presses which do poetry. We know that. So rather, I'm still struggling with this whole idea. It's still something that I yearn for, that when will Indian poets in India come together as a community rather than just, you know, slashing each other's throats? Because actually the pond is rather large. It's just a question of empathy, support. So in my own way, I have tried to do that. I mean, the anthology making part of it was purely a labor of love. And of course, anyone who's not in the anthology are instant enemies. How do I choose and so on? To me, it's a question of just purely the text. So if you look at both the Sahitya Academy anthology, which is almost like volume 2 of the HarperCollins anthology, it doesn't matter who the person is. For me, the personality of the poet, the celebrityhood of the poet is absolutely unimportant. It's the text that matters. Ultimately, that's all that matters. So I have in these books people I dislike personally, but their poetry might be good, so they're in the book. And that's the only way to move forward, really. Otherwise, we are just lonely creatures, you know, like flotsams floating around. I just wish there's more handholding and less toxicity in many ways. And I say this not just for poetry, it's just look at what is happening in the world, the right-wing fascist situation. Look at what we are living under. Look at the veneer of the middle classness which is exploding. There's so much negativity around.
I'm going to come in at this point to take us back to how you are responding to the situation of being in isolation without the direct mentorship that is possible with young people, which you do a great deal, without having that community of listeners face to face, that interaction of book launches, seminars, literary festivals. I'm certainly missing it. I don't know how you feel about it. How are you as a poet dealing with this pandemic condition? Not only the condition, but is any poetry coming out of you at this point?
So I'm dealing with it very, very well because this is my normal state. Most of the time I'm in isolation and in quarantine. Whether there's COVID or not, I'm actually most of the time, if I'm not traveling on work, I'm in my room, either reading or writing. So it's completely normal. So it's other people who are sort of getting used to this altered reality. For me, the reality hasn't changed at all. Yes, stepping out is difficult, but I'm enjoying many other things that this has brought us to. I like the fact that life is slow. I like the fact that I don't have to go to so many festivals and meet so many people and smile, people I don't necessarily want to really talk to. I'm really liking the fact that I can limit my conversations to very few people I really want to talk to and like. So it's made my life a lot simpler in many ways. Yes, on a practical level, I miss meeting my close friends socially. But that's got nothing to do with poetry. The mentorship continues because in any case, for the most part, it was online, either on the phone or on the screen. Unless they're Delhi based, the people I was mentoring, I would hardly see them. And the senior poets similarly, you know, they are getting more and more tech savvy. Even someone like Jayanta Mohapatra does WhatsApp. I mean, that is amazing. Someone who never even typed out his email replies. He had another young poet who used to do all that, but he does WhatsApp. That's amazing. So we send each other articles and so on. So in many ways, I'm actually loving it. My worry is the larger thing of intolerance and the schism between the rich and the poor and so on. The larger politics really affects me. But it's been also very, very, it's been a very rich time. In these 3 months, I've written a whole book. You have a copy of the PDFs, Mala. It's called Anthropocene, Climate Change and the Pandemic. And it's not an idea that is a new idea that I've been grappling with. For the longest time, at least for the last 10 years, I've been thinking very seriously on climate change. And pandemic happens to be an aspect of climate change. It's entirely man-made. We deserve what we get. This is something that we have done. And if we have cretins who ask us to bang plates and shower petals from their Air Force helicopters, I don't know where we are going, frankly.
Why don't you read us some of the poems, please?
Let me read out one short one. This one, let me just show it to you on the screen. New York Times did a front page after the first wave of the pandemic, this one, listing all the people who had died. This is the first page. It's like this epitaph, obituary column. And then there was another day they had just a black front page. So these two images are so stark that sort of got me writing, in terms of the visual prompt. And I just used the first two lines is the only headline from this particular day. It's called Obituary, and I quote from New York Times. They were not simply names on a list. They were us. Death knells peal, numbers multiply, virus ravages us one by one. No amount of hygiene ritual enables our lungs to resuscitate. Newspaper columns loom unsteady, ghostly apparitions on broadsheets. Name, age, date of death. Tall epitaphs in fine print. Ink spills, bleeds dark. Newsprint blotting out our wheezing breath. Our lives, micro-point-sized fonts on an ever-inflating pandemic list. Black specks, fugitive lonely numbers, the deceased on an official roster. Another sick, another dying, another dead. Yes, they were us.
Very sensitive. There's been so much talk about the meaning of home, Sudeep, and you have been writing on the subject for a very long time. Some of it probably comes from your own life experiences, as you said that you have had Bengali influence in your home in Delhi, in the family, and yet your upbringing, education has been in a cosmopolitan Delhi. Along with that, for many years, you had a parallel home in London. You've received prestigious scholarships from many places around the world and stayed lengths of time there, enough to, I suppose, bring in a certain kind of intellectual influence. So given these multiple homes that you might be relating to, you have poems about the subject. I just would like you to share something about your thoughts on home and maybe a poem or two on the subject, if that's okay.
So it is, well, again, another reference form in the word, Ghore Baire. In a sense, we are so used to it. It's a comfort zone. It's not a problem. So when you're not able to travel intellectually as a child, I just traveled in my imagination because all the books were there. The Bengali ethos allowed you to do that sort of thing. I don't want to go on and on about Bengali, but I realize the older I get, the so bheto Bangali I am. And I love it. I just love it. I just don't want to trade it for anything else. And to compound it, I live in a pada called Chittaranjan Park. I lived for 5 years in Bangladesh, translated some of the top poets there. And I realized living in Bangladesh, it was, you wake up in the morning and it's so, English is so irrelevant as a language. Without Bangla, you can't get along. So yes, so because I grew up in a very, very rooted space, I feel extremely rooted wherever I am in other spaces too, because ultimately the rootedness comes from a cultural context, not so much about whether you belong or you don't belong. If you grow up and believe in the fact that you belong to humanity and humanism as a whole, then actually the world is your oyster. And that's the space I operate from. So the cosmopolitanism and an extreme uber localization and the minutiae of my poetry work parallelly with equal ease as far as I'm concerned, because they're just two sides of the same coin, really.
One of my favorite poems is Flying Home from
Excellent.
Fractals.
Okay.
Why, can you read that for us?
Sure.
Please.
So, Flying Home, partly you all will relate to, is based in a zone of addresslessness. So much of our time we have spent flying from one country to another over neutral territories. Even though we possess a passport, we for moments inhabit those countries. You don't need visas to fly over them. It was an experiment also, which relates to Flying Home and Blank Letter are two parallel poems, two companion poems, much like, say, Milton's L'Allegro and El Penseroso, very much in that same sort of space. But it was also written at a time, it's an old poem. I'm glad you brought it up because it was not on my list. It was at a time when the AIDS epidemic was breaking and I lost a few friends. And if you remember in America, in the big stadium, each person, the family of the person who died would take a little bit of the quilt to the stadium and that would be linked onto, stitched onto a larger, other squares. And then there was this patchwork quilt that was made. Flying Home. I meticulously stitch time through the embroidered sky, through its unpredictable lumps and hollows. I'm going home once again from another home, escaping the weave of reality into another one that gently reminds and stalls to confirm my body is the stepson of my soul. But what talk of soul and skin in this day and age, such ephemeral things that cross-weave blood and breath into clotted zones of true escape? What talk of flight time and flying when real flights of fancy are crying to stay buoyant unpredictably in midair, amid pain, peace, and belief? Just like thin air sketches, where another home is built in free space vacuum, as another patchwork quilt is quietly wrapped around, gently in memoriam. Maybe I should read the companion poem.
The parallel poem, please. Yeah.
So this is again prompted by a very bizarre incident. I got a letter from a literary magazine I'd sent my poems. And I got a letter back. And when I opened the envelope, it was just a letterhead. There was no type. They obviously made a mistake. I got this blank letter. So that got me writing. And it's literally titled A Blank Letter. An envelope arrives unannounced from overseas containing stark white sheets, perfect in their presentation of absence. Only a bold logo on top reveals its origin, but absolutely nothing else. I examine the sheets, peer through their grains, heavy cotton-laid striations concealing text in white ink, postmarked India. Even the watermark's translucence makes their script's invisibility transparent, Buried among the involute contours lie sheets of sophisticated pulp, paper containing scattered metaphors, uncoded, unadorned, untouched, virgin lines that spill, populate, and circulate to keep alive its breathings. Corpuscles of a very different kind. Hieroglyphics, unsolved, but crystal clear.
Very beautiful, very beautiful. And that takes me to asking you something about the craft of writing, because yours is meticulously done, and I'm in particular going to refer to your poems related to dance. One of my favorites is Bharatnatyam Dancer, which you had dedicated to Leela Sampson. And it's a wonderful setting on the page, which looks like almost like a dance stage, if I may put it that way. And then the lines also seem to pick up the rhythm of the dancer's feet. Would you like to read that poem and tell us a little more about that kind of crafting?
So I like the pun on the fact that feet, it's literally feet and measure, as in poetry, as in prosody. So when I was watching her rehearse, the tal and the bowl of the particular rag or the song she was dancing was tadhinta taithaita, tadhinta taithaita. And when I was going through various drafts of the poem, somehow it was arranging itself in that beat. So then I said, why can't I invent a rhyme scheme which is the same as A, B, A, C, C, A, A, B, A, C, C, A. Tadhinta, taithaita, tadhinta, taithaita. It's a hidden rhyme scheme. So it's only when you sort of deconstruct the poem will you see it. So for me, using formal constructs are very important because then your skeletal or the skeleton of the poem is always strong. So whether a person likes your poetry or not, they can't destroy the poem in terms of structure, because not everybody will agree with your views and we don't have to. But a poem as a well-built art object is very, very important. And the fact as a Bengali, I dislike going to a gym because it's just a waste of time and energy. And plus, I don't think I feel very inspired doing it. So my own gymming is to do with crafting. So I batter and beat every poem I write. I could be accused, the poems could accuse me for domestic violence because I cut and chop so much. But the fact is at the end, what remains is the essence and there shouldn't be any fat when it comes to poetry. So that's my goal. So early years, my first 3 books, in fact, were very formal books. And I remember this is an episode, and if you've lived long enough, you have so many stories to tell. I remember going to Dom Moraes' house. He used to live in Sargent House with Leela Naidu. This was in Calabar Causeway then. Well, he was a young man. Well, I was super young. He was not very old. And all you want to hear from a senior poet you admire is something about your poetry, what he felt about the last book. So of course I went there and he uttered nothing. I'd given him the second book by then and he said nothing. So as I was leaving, of course I had to ask him, Dom, so what did you think of it? And he told me that, Sudeep, you know what? I miss the vulnerability in the poems, in the new poems. It's too well poised. At the time, I didn't really realize what he meant. So I was heartbroken. I came out and I said, all these years I've been striving to do this. But what he really meant was there has to be the perfect balance between craft and heart. Because if it's purely academic, if you're not moved, what's the point? But if it's purely sloppy, syrupy, falling all over the place, which is the case with most mediocre poetry, then it's problematic because it's too all over the place, really. And sometimes the content is not even that exciting. So that's my real thought on, craft. I think it's very important. It's also important to try and write in certain forms because only if you write in those forms, do you realize how hard it is to write in form? So writing a sonnet or a sestina or a canzone or a tritina, these are things I've done just to sort of hone my skills. And this is something I must say, I gained a lot in the creative writing programs abroad, because you have to do these exercises. And I consider these exercises are just like riyaz. You know, if you want to be a pop singer, you still have to be classically trained. So the classical basis for anything, I think, is very, very important.
Sudeep, I have a question on your translations.
Sorry, you also wanted me to read a poem on dance. So let me read one. Not maybe Bharatanatyam dancer, because it's rather long. Let me read a poem that I haven't read ever aloud. It's from the book I'm working on, The Whispering Anklet, Payal. And the book is done. It responds to various dance forms, Kathak, Bharatanatyam, Mohiniyattam, Kalaripattu, all sorts of things. And when I was structuring the book, I thought, you know, I'll have the poem and then I'll have a dancer's photograph or photographs with it. And then it was getting very complicated, because I'm in touch with many of these dancers, because I quietly go and watch everybody. I love dance. I think the biggest high I get is when I'm after seeing a good dance performance, I'm just floating in the air. It's just magical. So in any case, when some of these dancers, all big names, I have to tell you, so they got the, you know, when I spoke to them about arranging the books, they started sending me the pictures, and then some of them would say, "Mera picture kya color mein hoga? Or will it be on the cover?" I said, "This is getting crazy, you know." So then I dispensed with the entire thing of using different people's dance pictures, and I decided that I'm going to have just abstract photographs on dance, just the close-up of an eyelid, eyelash, or a swish of the fabric, or one toenail. And then I asked Aditi Mangaldas, who I think is one of our finest contemporary dancers, that would you model for me? And she says, yes, I'm happy to model for you, but all my seniors will kill me, you know, because this is, who's this? So I said, you know, don't worry, it's my book. You can just say it was my fault. And then I got another common friend whose work I really, really like, Dinesh Khanna, who's done the photography book Bazaar, if you see it. It's a big format book from Penguin. He shot her. And so now I have these incredible, fabulous pictures, abstract pictures on dance and the poetry. So I'll read out this particular poem called Kathak. This was written after I saw one of Aditi's performances at the Kamani, actually. Kathak. Deep within the eyes of a dancer, irises and poems bloom. On her cupped, curled, coal-lined eyelids, similes smile. On each eyelash, metaphors arch, waiting to flutter. On her bosom's electric silk fabric, secret lyrics are bloused. Her limbs, slender extension tips, decant arias, Tumri sing, soar. Her balletic grace liquid, she dances on water, always afloat. Even Khusro and Kabir, stunned, tongue-tied, searchingly compete to compose couplets for this dancer's next movement. Pupils wide-eyed, she cajoles, seeking her lover. Hidden in the dancer's heart, the beloved quietly resides.
So glad you read that poem, because I haven't heard this read aloud before.
Yeah, I actually
it's a real privilege. I want to ask you my last question for this session, which is about your translation, because you've emerged as a very major translator. And your translation of poetry, Arya, won the prestigious A.K. Ramanujan Translation Award. And lately, as we know from your interviews and of course our conversations also, you've been working with Urdu, Hindi, Bangla. Comparatively speaking, Which is the most difficult language to engage with? Or is that a very academic question? You can take it whichever way you like and maybe read us a sample of your beautiful translation.
Since I'm surrounded by academics, I'll be happy to answer this academic question. The toughest ones are the ones I translate from where I don't know the language actually. So now I know that throws you off. So Bangla, Hindi, and English, Bangla and Hindi are okay, and Urdu I would say the third most difficult because I can't read the script. So all the translations from Urdu I've done is from Devanagari, but then Devanagari and Urdu, very, very close. And anytime you have a problem, there are these wonderful websites called the rekta.org, which is fantastic. And then I rely on my friends to, get me through some, technical things. But then I've translated poems from Icelandic, from Hebrew, and so on. But these are poems I've translated sitting with the poet of that particular language. So what tends to happen is that particular poet's English as an academic subject is good, but it's not good enough to write poetry in English. So what then happens is they would give me an English literal, and then she and I would sit down and then I would construct it into an English language poem. So I would, and the way I translate whether it's Bangla, Urdu, or Hindi, or languages I don't understand, the oral quality is very important. So I ask the poet if he or she is alive to read the poems out aloud, and I actually take notations, or I ask other friends of mine to read the poems I'm reading and take notations. So the first 3-4 drafts of my poems are just blank grids, like a musical score sheet. So I have the sort of the ascenders and descenders, the dactyls and the trochees marked out on the line. So if it's a 10-syllabic line, I've actually mapped out the music of the poem before I've even translated the poem. So once I have the grid sheet in front of me, where the tonality and the pitch is perfect, then I go back and read the lines and translate phrase by phrase, word by word, and start putting them in and see what happens. And it's lovely, like a abacus. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. It takes forever because it's too time consuming. It's too anal, as some of my poet friends have told me, because you can get away with the looser translation. And a lot of the translations, good, well-known translations, people translate the story of the poem, which is great, but where's the poetry? Often it's so staccato, the roshta thakena. The inner tissue and the blood flow is so inherent to poetry. So once you get that bit right, the other part of the translation is not that difficult. So I use my science background, it's physics. It's just a lot of wordplay, fun, getting balancing equations. So it's a lot of fun. The thing is, poetry should be pleasurable. To me, it's a pleasurable act. It's not doom and gloom and, my heart is broken, I have to write, or, I do write poetry every day or read poetry every day. It's just part of my life. And when it's pleasure, then it's pleasure,
May I request you to end our session with the reading of Bonolata Sen, language that we all know among the audience members here, at least most of the members here, and a very loved poem, but your translation is, Sudeep, absolutely exquisite.
Okay, I will. I thought you might say that because I was going to read some other obscure translations I've been doing. Actually, one of the things, and this is not a plug, Anamika, the Hindi poet, she and I have been translating each other's poems for when I count back 30 years. We first met at Sahitya Academy at a young poets workshop. Since then, we have children, and children are married, and so on and so forth, and we still continue translating. And her book is coming out in August. Her selected poems, the first comprehensive book. So it's amazing that she's going to be turning 60, and not a single book in English is available of hers. That's how much we regard our poets and value our poets. Anyway, this is of course the classic, Jivananda Das's Bonolata Sen. And again, took me a long time, but if you hear the poem closely, it actually matches the same cadence and the rhythm of the original Bangla. That's what I'm really pleased about. So when you hear the poem, if someone says that it sounds like the original Bangla regardless of the fact that you're reading in English, that is the best prize I can get. And it's a nice poem to finish. Bonolata Sen, Jibanananda Das. For 1,000 years I walked this earth's passage by day and night. From Lanka's shores to Maloy's vast seas, I've traveled much, been a guest at Bimbishar and at Ashok's courts, stayed in the distant nights in the town of Vidarbha. I'm long worn out. Around me, waters of sea and life have endlessly swirled. My only peace, a fleeting moment snatched with her, Natorer Bonolata Sen. Chultar, Kobekar, Ondhokar, Bidishar, Nisha, like the dense ink night of Bidisha, her hair black, deep black, her face like the delicate weave of Shabosti's filigree frieze. Just as a lost boatman, rudderless, tossing in the far seas, chances upon a lush green isle of spice, I too caught a sight, saw her, a mere glimpse in the dark. Gently raising her eyes like a bird's nest, she whispered, "Where were you all this while?" And there she stands at my dream's end, my own Bonolata Sen. With soft settling hiss of dew, evening closes the day's end. Kites erase from their wings sun-stained smell of flight. When colors of the earth gently fade, fireflies light up their palette, and old songs find new lyric, old stories new score. Birds return home, so do the rivers, as life's trade, its give and take ceases. Only the dark stays, and just as it remains, so does, sitting by my side, face to face, my own Bonolata Sen.
Thank you very much, Sudeep.
Pleasure, pleasure.
Thank you, Shonjukta, Bashobi,
Lots of
Nishi, for
questions
giving
on the
me this
side.
opportunity to have a conversation with Sudeep.
Yeah, I can see lots of questions rolling on the side. So
Yes. Thank you so much. That was fascinating and interesting. And we do have questions. There are questions in the chat box. Malashri, should I ask those questions?
Yes, please.
I think so,
You
yeah.
go ahead and ask the questions and Sudeep will answer
Yes.
you.
We have questions here. There's also a question on social media. This is a question by Joydeep Sarangi. Joydeep asks, do you write drafts and come back to the poem again and again before the final version?
Yeah, I mean, I've answered this during the course of the chat. Yes, yeah. I mean, my poems go through many drafts. Sometimes the poem changes completely, and sometimes I throw away the poem. A poem I've loved very much, I throw it away because 2 years down the road the poem doesn't make sense. But yes. The initial drafts I find easy when you're doing the sort of large moving of chunks of words and phrases and deleting things and adding things. But the drafts towards the end as the poem is finishing, well, you can never finish a poem. At some point you have to just let it go. But certainly in the last 3-4 drafts, the kind of editing that happens for me is I'm changing a comma into a semicolon or vice versa. It's that half tone, the octave. I'm editing with my ear at that stage. So yes, editing is incredibly important. Yes.
Thank you so much. This is a question from Gopal Lahiri. Gopalda asks, since you're a Bengali, do you have any influence of Bengali poets in your on your poems? And if so, could you name, any particular example?
One is Jivananda Das, of course. How can you escape him? He infected me before Ezra Pound did. Thanks to my parents, really. And then Qazi Nazrul Islam. I mean, I remember Shobhashachi's recitation. We still have the cassettes and the records at home. Bolobir, the entire thing shakes. How can you not have goosebumps with these fabulous Bengali poets? I mean, we had so many. But to me, the palette was not just Bengali. Bengali was an easy entree because I was surrounded by that. Hindi was equally an entree, and my mother was very good with languages, So the first time I got into Kafi Azmi it was a very Bengali setup where all the men were having their whiskey and we were watching cricket, and she was just utterly bored of the same conversation. Kon wicket ta poreche, auto score, sorry. She just charged into the rooms reciting Aurat, the famous poem by...
Yeah.
So that's how, things happen. It was a process of osmosis. Also, both my grandparents, my grandmother and my mother had a pujo ghar, and I really, even though we were not expected to sit for the prayers, just the chanting of the prayers embedded a certain kind of rhythmic quality into my early poetry, which I've carried on since. And that was a big, important thing. I think reading poetry aloud is very important. Learning poetry by heart is even more important. Some of my mentors have been so strict with me that, they won't even talk to me if I have not read. I mean, I have not learned a poem by heart before I've come to see them, because the orality of the poem is very important. And as you can see, a lot of good editing actually happens when you read it aloud. So Bangla, of course, but I mean, my influences ranges from, Pablo Neruda and Arina Ratushinskaya and Enzensberger, all kinds of people, books I've accidentally tripped upon, stolen from my grandparents. I still have a fabulous series of the Penguin Modern Poets series, those thin volumes, which I, under his nose, stole. He allowed me to do so. And I still don't have 2 of the 28 volumes that came out. So I will email you if someone has it. I'm happy to have them. But yes, Bengali is the easy first layer, but Hindi and other languages, yeah.
This is a question from Mandakini Bhattacharya. She asks, do you agree that modern English poetry is becoming more and more like prose?
I don't think she's reading enough good poetry. That's my answer to the question. A lot of mediocre poetry sounds like prose, yes. The problem is with new technology, you can write a sentence, chop it up into 5 parts, arrange it in a column, and print it out on the laser printer with a nice font. And suddenly, lo and behold, it looks like a professional poem. You read it and you'll be sort of flying away from that page because it's just so poorly written. Often. You just have to scroll Facebook to see the kind of stuff that's being done, I don't understand the impatience the youngsters, the millennials have, because sure, put a poem in, but put a link in. Once it's published, it's gone through the rigor of some publication, sure, put it in, because we all want to share. But something that you've written last night, or you're suddenly angry at the world and you're spouting sort of 5 staccato words, that is not poetry, I'm sorry to say. So that is not even good prose. So bad poetry sounds like prose, but both good poetry and fine prose sounds like poetry. Isn't that what Wisława Szymborska said? Or read a wonderful prose writer like Pico Iyer. You read his books and it's just sheer poetry, nothing else. But he just writes in just elegant prose. And good poetry doesn't even require too many huge words. And that's what you edit out. Make it as elegant and simple as possible. The intelligent people read into it. But I just think there's not enough rigor. That's the problem.
This is a question which we from Facebook. Rahul Singh has this question. He would like to know if there is one unified working tradition in Indian poetry, or should there be a unified tradition? Because if there isn't, it becomes difficult for a young poet to identify with one tradition and work in it. Would love to hear your comments on it. Also, if you could throw some light on the Anglophone tradition and where is it today?
Okay, so couple of different things altogether. Let me just take the second one first. It's easier to answer. I think good Anglophone poetry in India is in very good hands. I mean, just pick up my HarperCollins book or the Sahitya Academy book I've done. Just see that's 150 poets straight away you can read who are doing really good work. And there are many more that you can only accommodate that many. I constantly say this, in various lectures and whenever people ask me this question, that the best of Indian poetry that is being written now is far superior than the prose that's coming out of India. Indian poetry, the good Indian poets are just out there, very, very fine poets. But unfortunately, the way things work, the markets work, fiction gets published more. I don't have a problem with it. More of my friends are fiction writers. But the fact is that not enough people read poetry, and part of it is also poorly taught. I mean, it's atrociously taught in schools and colleges, So academics have to take a large blame for it, It's the last thing they'll do. It's also taught in a way that it's not enjoyable. I remember in my school, Shakespeare was taught by my brothers. We had Richard II, for instance, and the brother would fly into our class. Old John of Gaunt, time-honored Lancaster, has thou according to thy oath and bat. And all of us boys be eating tiffin, doing all sorts of things, are starstruck. That's how poetry should be taught, or any literature is taught. It's not just for the exams. So poetry is in very good hands. There are very, very fine poets writing in English. Is there a unified tradition in India? Let me just put the plug on because the battery is going. Is there a unified tradition in Indian poetry? No, not at all. And if there was one, that would be really sad because we have such a rich tradition. So I would say if a young poet is floundering and doesn't know where to go, start with your own language. If it's Marathi, start there. If it's English, that's fine. I mean, every language has a huge tradition. And there's a wealth of it. So start reading your colleagues, start reading the good magazines that are around. Buy other people's book, for God's sakes. That would be a nice start. Please, poets, do not give your books out for free, because you're not doing any, you're doing disservice to poetry. Yes, if you're swapping a book with another friend who's a poet, that's a different thing because it's the equal trade. But there has to be strict sort of guidelines. Also, ask people to value poetry. Ask people to value time. You should be getting paid for what you do. Poetry is not for free. I'm glad I'm being paid for this. But unless you ask, the organizers don't even think about it. It's shocking. So yes, those are the traditions we can get away with. We can delete. But as far as various traditions in different languages, there's plenty. And I would start with the ones which are most familiar to us and then expand outward.
Could we have a few questions from the participants here? Bashobidi, I totally agree with what you said about, hearing poetry, speaking it aloud, listening to it.
Yeah, I mean, you're transfixed. Poetry is like magic. Good poetry is like magic. It just doesn't compare with anything. And let's face it, you're talking about different genres. You're talking about dance. Dance cannot survive without poetry because all the songs that people dance to are actually poetry sung aloud. Theater is the same thing. It's dialogue delivered as a poem. And also, we need to demystify poetry. Let's face it, the most important aspects, times in our life, we resort to poetry. Love, heartbreak, birth of a child, death. More often than not, you'll have a poetry book next to your bedside table, which you can dip in and out of. A novel you read and move on. So we need to demystify it. Poetry is all around us. You just have to open your eyes and ears to it. Of course, I'm completely manically, devoutly worship the god of poetry, but it's easy. It's so easy. It's just so much around us.
Could we have a few more questions? Bashobidi, Sanjuktadi.
Has Bashubi left?
I can
No,
see her.
Bashabidi is here.
She's
Bashubi,
looking gorgeous with her red background, incarnadine walls.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I bring the tone down a little because I have a doll's house at the back.
Ah,
But it's just where the plug point is. So my books are on other walls. No, I've just hugely enjoyed this session, and I'm so glad that poetry has been reaffirmed by Sudeep and Mala. And I think what I enjoyed about the session is Sudeep's Sudeep not just being eclectic but cosmopolitan, and you know, valuing the his own heritage and poets across the world. So you know, it's a great platform to put poetry on, where it resonates, you know, right across the globe from where you are based. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Bashubi. And we've spent time together in Scotland. I mean, I was a poet in residence at the Scottish Poetry Library. We have a very, very, well, he's no more sadly, a very fine common friend called Angus Calder. That's how I got to know Bashubi. And Angus Calder is one of the, you know, is one of the big critics and a very fine poet. So, you know, with poetry, the kinds of friendships you make is just remarkable because they actually like poetry. Nothing else matters. So,
Nishidi, could I just get in a word?
Yes, please.
Shudipta, I was talking of published poetry. So like I've been reading poems in anthologies which are like short stories or which are like designed like a quiz. How do you, I mean, that was basically what my question was about, because it reads more and more like prose.
What do you mean by quiz? Just tell me a bit more.
Yes, sir. It's like designed like a quiz, multiple choice answers. I've read a prize-winning poem like that. I mean, it was called a poem, and I couldn't understand why it is being called a poem. Try how many times I read it, I couldn't find the lyricism or the rhythm in it. Yes, it was very pertinent, a poignant subject and everything, but it was designed like questions and multiple choices as answers given below the questions, and the choice was very like clear which one you should take. So, and then there have been poems, prize-winning poems again in journals, in foreign journals, which are reading like stories, an entire short story put there.
Yeah. So, you know, there is a tradition of poetry called Goddo Kobita, which is prose poetry,
Yes.
which is precisely that. So the demarcation line between prose poetry and microfiction is very, they're very close. You can sort of club it either way, depending on how you want to do it. But, you know, either way, those are very, very tightly and beautifully written, if it's good. So that's a tradition of poetry which has been carrying on from, you know, times immemorial. The other thing is different, you know, you want to challenge yourself. So, you know, you start using different constructs. So this Q&A kind of poetry you're talking about was introduced by an American poet because, you know, she was actually taking the piss out of the exam system. But effectively, when you read the poem and then answers 1, 2, 3, 4, none of the answers were actually the answers to the above question, but they were just provocations to the whole idea of poetry or what poetry should be. So you have to work a little hard with these kinds of poems because there are poets who, Anne Carson, I would recommend you should read. She's very difficult. She's a classicist. And if you read her poetry on the page, it's very difficult. It's very dense to get through. But once you crack the codes, which is also part of the beauty of anything, isn't it? If you're watching thriller and if you can guess the murderer before the end of the film, isn't it a great thrill? The same thing with good poetry. You know, so there are various formats within poetry which you can use. People are now writing a poem as a newsreel. You know, how the, you know, 6 o'clock broadcast in the morning, afternoon bulletin, prime time, and then at the end, and what are you left with? The same of, you know, so the more you see the different kinds of poetry that are being written and the past, you'll realize that it is, the structure is important if it's being done well. The structure is very important because it leads you to different areas which otherwise won't be apparent to you, because what you're used to is just straightforward poetry on the page, which looks like a poem. That's only one kind, isn't it? A sari can be worn in so many different ways. Yesterday, there was a wonderful session on JLF with Mukulaka Banerjee and someone, she wrote a book called The Sari, and they were just saying the 100 and I don't know how many, 200 ways of just draping a sari. But the problem is, why isn't anything reinvented so that it becomes more applicable? But the baseline remains the same. You just have to write it well. There's no getting away with it. You use the same rules in poetry as in prose. It has to be grammatically correct. A lot of poets tell me that you can get away with, gerunds and prepositions because, oh, it's poetry. We don't need it. Of course you need it. It has to make sense grammatically, unless you're actively doing something against it, and that may be one point.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
I have a question.
Yes.
In fact, several. Congratulations, Sudeep. You were fantastic. It was lovely listening to you. My first question would be, because you are talking about these young poets who are emerging right now, and would you recommend some foundational texts for them which they should read? Not about how to write poetry, but what poems to read. And my second question would be that, do you say that you are Bengali to the hilt? To the hilt is more Scottish though. So Bengali.
He's Scottish.
Yeah.
You can outdrink a Scottish man.
Yeah.
No, I can't.
But then you just did not mention Tagore. It broke my heart.
I know. I saw the sort of weepy-eyedness in you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And the third thing is, do you dance when you're alone?
Very badly, yes.
I guess.
I'm out of step, but I'm enjoying it myself when I do it.
Yeah.
So the reason I didn't mention Tagore is because Tagore was not an early influence in my life. I mean, I was surrounded by Tagore being in a Bengali space. So actually, as a youngster, I had an aversion to Tagore because it was oozing out of every orifice. Tagore was the god. I actually prefer the modernists much more, like Jivananda Das and so on, Qazi Nazrul Islam. But in my later life, I mean, I read Tagore and I was more interested in short stories, his paintings, his essays. I mean, he's an incredible man. I mean, he's a polymath, and there are some Tagore scholars here. Bashobi has written a wonderful book, which you should read. So my entry into Tagore as a mature reader was much later. The other part is, of course, Tagore was translated so poorly for such a long time that it just came across in the English language so poorly. In Bangla, it's a different thing, but when you read it in English, it just doesn't hold up, unfortunately. Gitanjali won the Nobel Prize, but it was one of the worst translations I've ever seen done by him. So yeah, sorry to break your heart, but there are better poets than Tagore in the Bengali pantheon. But Tagore is, you can't give gold medal, silver medal, bronze medals to the same people all the time. It's high time that we also see other people outside of Tagore. And I have nothing against Tagore. I've got Robi Thakurer pechone amar thik ekhanei ache. So, all due respect. What was the other question, you said?
And the first one, I said, what would be some of the foundational texts? That's poetry that those who are just beginning to write need to read. And
I think that's the main thing, isn't it?
Stanza forms is also important, and to be aware of traditional stanza patterns which they can follow just in order to understand the discipline of writing, which was a very good suggestion, really.
So these books are very, very easily available. Any book on prosody is very easily available. Now on the internet, you can see lots and lots of books. I mean, a lot of poets have written creative writing books about this. So there's also...
I would say that more...
So there's Ellie Hirsch's, sorry?
Right. Applied how to write would be the names of poets that you would like to mention, whom the young aspirant poets and also the very talented young poets, they would like to read in order to even advance whatever they are doing right now.
I would say even the senior poets should be reading some more poetry, you know. I mean, the senior poets, many of the senior poets haven't quite got there. They're just older in age and not necessarily
So
as
the
good in
senior
terms
poets
of,
are all always
they need
reading.
to renew themselves, because sometimes I find the younger poet is actually much more in the groove when it comes to prosody because they are interested in it. So prosody is something that is a technical side to it, which is just tedious. You know, it's not so much fun unless you like playing with sounds and numbers. It's all about numbers and sounds. So you have to give yourself tasks. Today, let me write a sonnet. And of course, when I was first asked to write a sonnet, my response was when I was in school, it's so meaningless in this contemporary world. Who writes a sonnet? Is it relevant? But the reason they were asking me to do it was it's incredibly hard to do one properly, you know.
Yeah.
Haiku. Anybody who writes in 3 lines thinks they've written a haiku. There are so many components to a haiku, apart from just the simple 5-7-5 syllabics. If you explore the waka poetry tradition in Japanese waka poetry tradition, the entire system of numerology and poetic structures based on the 5-7 formula. So when it's 5-7-7-5, it's a bususeka, then there's a sedoka, there's tanka. So each tradition has its sort of own interest, so you have to sort of get interested in it. It's very difficult to prescribe something. I would say anybody who wants to be a poet should read Milton. I mean, the man took 12 books to write one poem, and then that wasn't done. He had to write another 4 to regain the paradise. You know, some of these, and Milton is actually not a difficult poet. It's great fun because it's a story about war and God and loss, and is once you get into the rhythm, or a shorter poem like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, you know. But if you hear it aloud, that helps. So I would say, unfortunately, the British Council libraries don't have these resources anymore. You know, in the British Council libraries before, you used to get the Cade Mong Argos records. You can get them digitally now, where all these great actors are reading out the poem. You know, Richard Burton and so on, and John Gielgud. So when you get trapped by that, then you are infected for good. So I would say, yeah, listen to poetry, read it aloud. Prosody is very important as a sort of side note that you keep doing. It's like classical music, nothing else. You know, you have to keep practicing the same the rag so many times so that you can get the sort of variations of the tonalities of these. So I would say these, and you know, you can pick any good poem and learn from it. So there are no foundational texts. The big ones are of course there. No, not really. The big ones are of course like Milton and Shakespeare. How can you not, or the big Indian poems.
What about the Bible?
Well, we read the Bible in college. I mean, when you are an undergrad, it's not the most exciting text to read because you want to be doing other things. But we did do the Book of Job in my undergraduate years. It was taught very badly, unfortunately. But it does help because the entire text structure is that, and also for English literature, Bible is such an important kind of backdrop essence.
Put it as a foundational text.
Yes, it's a foundational thing. But poetry is not limited to the English lit types. Poetry is meant for everybody. So a mathematician can write good poetry. An economist can write good poetry. The moment we try and put these strictures that this is how it's done, then it's a problem. The thing is,
the mathematicians and economists are always getting into everybody's fields, especially poetry. But we can't get into maths.
Of course we can get into maths.
We can never get into nanoscience, though we would love.
We are doing nanoscience. I mean, when you're doing scansion in poetry, what is it? It's nanoscience. When I was telling you about editing, the final editing that I did for a particular poem where I removed 1 dot over a comma because it was just that 1 octave more when I was reading the poem, that is nano editing, nanoscience. Punctuations are scientific symbols, ultimately. They're just basically breath pauses.
I'm not sure the nanoscientists would agree with you. But anyway, Great fun, Sudeep. I learned a lot, and it was wonderful listening to you, and also the way you read your poems. It's not only what you have written, not the content, but also the poet as reader. It resonates in the mind, and you've been brilliant doing that also for
Thank
us.
you so much. That's very, very kind. I was also surrounded by very, very kind people, so it was easier. You know, when you have kind souls, I can see on the screen little rectangular boxes who are smiling and are appreciative. Makes my life a lot easier. So thank you, and thank you, Mala. Mala has always been such a pleasure. You know, our friendship goes back to I don't know when. You know, and she's now what? You know, you're doing a play on Madhusudhan Datta, right? Uh,
That's
um,
right.
yeah. So I think again, remember the last time we met, we were in a sort of poetry soiree at Mala's house. That's how you enjoy poetry. The last thing the poet should be thinking about is publication and competition. Unfortunately, that's what kills relationships, I find. Enjoy it, you know, read each other's work, translate. So much of my translation has happened because I actually just have loved another person's poem and I wanted more readership about that, you know, so other people can read it in the English language. So I would translate a friend's poem. That's how it really happens. And then that sort of aggregates over time the longer you live. But the critical thing is enjoy, it's pleasurable.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful listening to you and Malashri Di and hearing you speak. I was just reminded of a recent reading of the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, which happened during the lockdown. I
Yes,
forget
yes,
who did it, but it's been just wonderful, a wonderful evening. And I would request Joydeep. Uh,
Our
Joydeep? Yes, Joydeep Sarangi is the Vice President of IPPL Kolkata. And I would request Joydeep to please deliver the formal vote of thanks.
It was really a wonderful session of poetry and togetherness. Wonderful. Red spills into our hearts, Sudeep. Thank you so much. Congratulations. Yeah.
my pleasure.
And you made new plants wait for new heat to grow and to mature in your own time. Yeah. And thank you, Malashri, for cheering it so well. And you really brought to the surface the best in Sudeep. And Sudeep was not only a poet today, but also a great academician. He made things so simple. You know, he talked about different aspects of poetry, new poetry, commitments, and different partnerships, and the modes of translations, visibility of poets, and poetry traveled with Sudeep. That is a big part because he took part in different poetry festivals in different continents. He made friendships at different grounds, and which which contributed a lot to Indian poetry. I find Sudeep as a great soul maker, a great traveler. He traveled with poetry, and he had great contribution to contemporary Indian English poetry. I'm totally agree with Sudeep that poetry makes friendships, poetry makes bridges among continents, among good hearts. And he said he's surrounded by noble hearts like Maladi, Shantuktadi, Bashavidi. And it's really, poetry makes things happen. And poetry can move you into and turn you to a poet as well. And he went into the details of poetry writing and how one beginner in poetry can read poems and come back to the poem again and again. The drafting of poems, that is very essential because something tips from Sudeep means a lot, because there are so many, I think, viewers today who actually watched Sudeep live today and made a planning that they would be future poets as well. So this evening is a part of investment in poetry, Sudeep. Thank you so much. Thank you, Maladi, for very precious questions, and you actually brought out Sudeep's best. Thank you. And thank you, Bashaviti and Shangjuktadi, always our mentors and the guiding forces of IPPL Thank you, Nishi, for steering IPPL so successfully towards the right direction. And we cannot forget that the evening is dedicated to none other than Dr. H.K. Kaul, a prominent poet, editor. We are heartbroken. So this particular evening of poetry is totally dedicated in memory of Kaul. He was a great man. He will be remembered again and again. To all viewers, listeners, and the budding poets, established poets, half-established poets, this evening was an investment. Thank you all for being there and for being with poetry. I think poetry will give you something to look for at this world of pandemic. We'll see you again very soon because we have another big event coming up very soon from IPPL. Stay tuned, all soul makers, to all poets. Thank you. Thank you. You really made and contributed to this evening, contributed to the world of poetry so well. We remain grateful to you. Grateful to you, Manali. Grateful to you.
Thank you, Jagdeep.
Bashabidi.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sudeep, Shangjukta, Nishi, and everybody. We'll be back again very soon. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank
It was
you.
a real
Thank
pleasure to be
you.
part of the
So
family.
we have one program on Sunday at 5 p.m. this Sunday. This will be reading Rabindranath Tagore. And we have another program on the 10th where we'll have Keki Daruwala with us. And that is going to be another conversation, another session of poetry. Please join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Malavi. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.